Welcome. You are in session for meaningful engagement with Maryland's Latinx community. If you mean to be here, you're in the right place. My name is Lindsay Baker. I am the Executive Director for Patapsco Heritage Greenway, and I am the moderator for this session. We have three wonderful presenters. I am going to read you their bios. Oh, we're in order. Michelle Ramirez is the Multicultural Outreach Coordinator for the Department of Natural Resources. She has a BS focused in environmental science and policy, wildlife ecology and management from University of Maryland College Park. Michelle runs the Esme Potkin program for the Maryland State Parks. Gabrielle Rolfe is a project and partnership coordinator at the Chesapeake Conservancy. She has an MS in environmental science from Towson University. Gabrielle has experience engaging Latinx communities with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through building urban partnerships and community engagement programs in Kansas City, Denver, and Baltimore. Camilla Sandoval is a recent graduate of UMBC's Historical Studies program, where she wrote her master's thesis on the representation of Latinx in the National Register of Historic Places. In the summer of 2018, she created the Community Outreach and Engagement Toolkit, focusing on building relationships with the Latinx community. So I'm going to read some ground rules for this session. Our wonderful presenters have developed these, and at the end of their presentation, we're going to have 15 minutes for questions, which I'm going to walk my mic around to you all during that. Here are the ground rules. Be mentally and physically present, one speaker at a time. Be mindful of the different feelings and experiences people bring with them. Step up, step back. This one is meant to keep anyone, oh, that's it. Step up, step back. And focus on the idea, not the person.
We just want to thank you all for taking time to come to our session. This topic is near and dear to all of our hearts, and we're excited to share our experiences with you and hope that our experiences will help to inform the programs that you might be trying to run with your organizations and institutions. And we have a lot of lessons learned from what works and what doesn't work, and hopefully you can take those best practices with you. Today we are going to mainly be looking at a toolkit that Camilla developed with the Patapsco Heritage Greenway, and Michelle and I are going to be providing some case studies of some practices that we have used, and it's going to thread the toolkit in throughout the presentation. But we hope that from learning about the toolkit and from hearing about the experiences that you'll understand how to know your users or your visitors, how to assess your cultural competency of the organization, how to create and strengthen relationships with communities, and how you might be able to come out of here and establish some short and long-term goals for the programs that you are running.
So some brief background on the toolkit that Gabby just introduced, and that we'll be using as our kind of framework for our presentation. I joined Patapsco Heritage Greenway as an intern in the summer of 2018. Among the organization's roles and responsibilities is to act as a mediator between Patapsco Valley State Park and the communities that use the park. And so one of the largest park user groups are Latinxes. And Patapsco Heritage Greenway wanted to find ways to improve their relationship with this community. I was brought on to help with these efforts. One of my projects was to create this toolkit that could serve as a guide for cultural organizations to either start or strengthen their existing outreach and engagement efforts with Latinx audiences. So I reviewed relevant literature, I researched models of different parks and organizations, and I met with local organizations who were already embracing this kind of work. And from there I was able to break it down into these fundamental 4 parts that we just covered. And so we'll follow that order, and we'll start with knowing your users and visitors.
So in knowing your audience, one of the things that we deal with is labels. So sometimes people love labels, sometimes people hate them, but we were very deliberate in what we were going to name our presentation. which we chose Latinx. But even as we were having a conversation between the three of us, we weren't sure how, even being part of that community, we all had different sentiments on what we like to be labeled. Somebody went with Latinx, somebody went with Hispanic, somebody went with country of origin. So we know that it's tricky, and we know that the terminology that's used in most publication is the term Hispanic. So you'll see it throughout the presentation because most of the slides are using census data or research data that uses that name. So the term Hispanic started in the 1970s in the Nixon administration to kind of give a better name to that community. And it was first used in the 1980, it was first used in that census. So the definition is people that speak Spanish or are descending from Spanish-speaking populations. So that makes sense. All of us speak Spanish and are descendants from Spanish-speaking populations. So we fit as Hispanic in that label. So it originates from the word Hispanicus, which was the term to call people from Hispania, which turned into España, which is present-day Spain. But a lot of the reasons why people don't like to use the term Hispanic is because it has that link to conquest and the bloodshed of the indigenous lands. And it just uses the culture after colonization and only uses the Spanish language and gets rid of the indigenous languages and a lot of the other rich languages that are used in those countries. So it's more cultural and it uses just language. So the term Latino, instead of cultural for language, uses the geography of Latin America. So this first became popularized in 1997 and was used for the 2000 census. And it defines people who come from that region. And Latino is just the shortened phrase for the Spanish word Latinoamericano. So it's a little bit more inclusive in that it takes into account all the languages that are spoken in this region. But even people that fit Latino or Hispanic, once they were polled, 51% of them said they rather use country of origin, and that's kind of where I fit. So I was born in Colombia. I moved to the United States when I was 9 years old, and growing up, I never had to think about if I was Latino or Hispanic. I was always just Colombian. So when I came here, I was like, oh, I didn't know I had to pick. Like, I'm just Colombian. So when we're going to these communities, it's important to know how they like to be identified. Some people have different preferences. Some people don't, it doesn't matter to them. But we want to be as meaningful and as inclusive as we possibly can, so that's why we take the time to look at it and break it down. So we know it's a little bit tricky, and we know that you'll get tripped up, and if you've always been using Hispanic, you'll probably say it, and even throughout the presentation, that's going to be the terminology that's used there the most. But we chose the term Latinx because even though Latino is more inclusive than Hispanic, we wanted to take that step further. So the Spanish language is very gendered with nouns and adjectives that end in O being masculine, ending in A is feminine. So the word Latino is masculine, no matter who you are. If it's 5 women and 1 man comes in, then it all becomes masculine. So in the 90s, they tried to switch that by using the @ sign, which is the A with the O around it. That way it was O and A, but even that just wasn't enough. So in 2004, in the internet community, activists and students started using Latinx. And then that kind of went on to academia. So even though it started in 2004, it might not be as popular now, but in 2018, it was recognized by Merriam-Webster Dictionary. So it now has a definition on there. And in the 2019 Democratic debates, one of the candidates used the term Latinx. So, and now it's starting to become more popular in publication, but definitely still in the academic realm. So we want to just normalize that term, and that's why we used it for today. So why is all of this important? So we know anecdotally that the Latinx community is growing. So we wanted to look at that, and we looked at the 2000 to 2000 census with the next one happening next year. So the minority population is growing, and minority just means anybody that's not Hispanic white. So from 2000 to 2010, the population grew by 606,000, while the non-Hispanic white population dropped 129,000. So the state's population minority grew from 37.9% to 45.3%, and it's the 7th highest minority percentage in the country. And that's what's driving our economy and everything. So it's something that we need to pay attention to and get ahead of. So the population breakdown. So okay, we have a lot in Latinx, but who are they? What are they? So this breaks it down, showing that Salvadorians are the highest amount in Maryland, with 124,000 people as of 2010. And I know with the new census, that's gonna shoot up. And it's followed by Mexicans with 88,000. And something that's interesting about the Latinx community is that it's a lot younger than the state's median. So with the younger age of the mean being 28 years old, that drives a lot of different economies and who's voting, who's making decisions, and who's gonna be an influence later on. And same thing with Mexicans, their mean age is 25 years old. So out of that, we saw that at the country as a whole, Latinx people make up 1 in every 6 people in the country, and children, they make up 1 in every 4. So with this, it's a study that was done by Hispanic Access Foundation in 2015, and it was something that at that point was groundbreaking. I work for the Department of Natural Resources, which encompasses the Maryland Park Service. So this study was done at Sandy Point State Park, which is in Annapolis, and it asked the questions that everybody looked around and saw, but nobody took the time to document. So this intern went around and asked ethnicity. So it was crazy to see that 82% was Hispanic. 83% of those people have been reoccurring visitors. And they were 73% were coming from Maryland, but 19% were coming from Virginia. So people were driving a very long distance to come to this specific park in Annapolis, which is driving the economy around it. And it helps us gauge who's coming in, if we want them to do volunteering opportunities, if you want to include them into the workforce. It's important to know, oh, where do you live? Are you coming from nearby? Would you be able to commute for work? Or are you just coming here for a family vacation? So we saw that a lot of people were traveling pretty far. And thinking as a park, we think about rules and regulations. So it was crazy to see that 45% of the people got the rules and regulations just by looking around. And only 2% of people went to the website and actually ahead of time looked at the rules. And for us as a department, we always say, oh, put it on Facebook, put it on Twitter, the world will see. Well, a demographic of the world will see. But we know that Latinx communities are the highest user base, and they're not the ones that are clicking and looking at this. So this is when there's safety issues, park closures, anything that we thought that Facebook, Twitter was enough. So now that was a lot of information for us to take in. Same thing with signs. Did you read any of the signs? 22%, which is the highest percentage, said no. And 1% said a couple. But within this study, we also found out that not everybody that was there was literate. So if all these signs are wordy and giving all this great information, but you can't read it, then what's the point in looking? So that's kind of when we transition into more picture-based and being able to do it that encompasses all languages. And I know that that's a study that was done that was great for the park, and Patapsco Heritage Greenway is doing the same type of surveys at Patapsco currently, and that information is used for their grants as well as for the park's user base to see what the needs and what the wants are, and that helps the better customer service. And that's what created the program Esme Potkin. So this is a program manager for this program. It started in 2016 after that study because we saw this information. We're like, we have to do something about it. So the reasoning behind it was to improve the customer service and reduce those access barriers. So it's a multi-unit approach. So we use natural resources police officers who we know are scary. They have the uniform, they have the utility belt. But we also have park rangers that are civilian, that wear the same color scheme, the green pants and the tan shirt, but are civilian. So just because you know that the police officers are officers, you don't make that distinguishing factor with the rangers, so you kind of just avoid all uniforms. So we wanted to bring that closure, and we wanted to build that trust. We have Chesapeake and Coastal that's doing environmental education. We have Fisheries and Boating that's doing casting rod lessons and talking about fishing and boating regulations. We saw last year that out of all the boating deaths, 99% of them were older Latinx men. So we're like, why is that? So they know that the kids need to wear the life jackets, but the older adults get hot, they don't want to. So we're trying to break that barrier. So we bring the kids in with the environmental education, and then the grown-ups kind of linger in afterwards, and that's when we talk to them about the rules, the regulations, even just trash-free parks. Maryland Park Service parks are trash-free, which is a tricky concept and doesn't have a direct translation. So that's kind of why we talk about why translation isn't enough. Just saying things are trash-free doesn't make sense in Spanish. So we also want to show that these jobs in natural resources are viable options. So we know that the Latinx community loves to be outdoors, loves to be around water. That's how they grew up, and that's what they want to pass on to their generations. So we want to make sure to let them know that you love the outdoors, you're already here, you could work here, this could be a whole living. And we went from 4 events to 6 events, so it's every other Saturday of the summer, and we hit Sandy Point, Greenbrier Point. Look at all of these parks, what they have in common is water. And these are the parks that are driven by the Latinx community. And they bring in so much income for the whole park service, but nothing was being done to reach what was bringing that income. So we're taking that step. And we've also partnered with Chesapeake Conservancy, which is where Gabby's from, because we knew that one event and leaving wasn't gonna be enough. We knew that we had to be there and build that relationship. If you didn't see us that day, you would have never known we were there. So now we have 2 interns that speak Spanish out of Chesapeake Conservancy, and they're at Sandy Point during the week, during the weekends, building that relationship, because we know that 83% keeps coming back. So if they keep seeing the same people back, that trust builds and builds, and that's something that we want to establish at the rest of these parks.
Now, in addition to knowing and familiarizing yourself with Latinx users or visitors, organizations need to take the time to reflect on their own ability to respectfully and authentically engage with these communities. So then here, assessing your cultural competency becomes essential to the success of the relationship that you hope to have. So this means looking inwards and making sure that you're capable of appreciating cultural differences and working effectively with those differences. And this assessment can take place, or should take place, both at an individual and an organizational level. On an individual level, you can educate yourself and take note of your own conscious and unconscious biases to make sure that they don't negatively influence the ways that you interact with different audiences. On an organizational level, we can take a look at the cultural competency reflection sheet that should be on everyone's seat. Here we can see that top to bottom, bottom up, everyone in your organization needs to be on the same page. And that means not just agreeing that diversity and inclusivity is important, but making sure that everyone understands the ways in which our professional fields can perpetuate inequities and implicitly exclude, or sometimes explicitly exclude people of color from being a part of the work that your organization wants to do. So for example, numbers 5 and 6 address policies, structures, and practices, as well as recruiting and hiring practices. So even if you're not saying, oh, we won't hire X person, there's still ways that you keep people from wanting to join or even being able to stay at your organization. So it's important to take an honest look at yourself and identify areas for improvement and make genuine changes that you can implement as you go forward. So knowing your audience and assessing your cultural competency become key when you start creating relationships with Latinx communities.
So I'm going to tell you all a story of a community that I engaged with in South Baltimore that really hits upon all of the different lessons that we're trying to learn when engaging with Latinx communities. And this took place a few years ago, back when I used to work for the National Aquarium. We're a partner in the Masonville Cove Urban Wildlife Refuge Partnership, which is in South Baltimore, adjacent to the communities of Brooklyn and Curtis Bay. And these are two very underserved communities with very limited resources and access to green spaces or to other community amenities. And through this partnership, we were trying to establish a relationship with the communities and this green space in their community. And since then, we've been using this model and I've been traveling around the country with the Fish and Wildlife Service to build similar partnership programs because this one was pretty successful. So Masonville Cove, back in the 1940s and 50s, was a beach site where local residents in South Baltimore got to go and swim in the harbor, believe it or not. And over time, the railroad tracks came in and cut the community off from the water, and it became a dumping area. And it was considered a brownfield by the EPA. Fast forward to the early 2000s, the Maryland Port Administration decided to clean up the area and do an environmental remediation of the green space. And now it is a beautiful environmental education center that is run by Living Classrooms Foundation in partnership with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Aquarium and the Port Administration. And there they have an environmental education center, they have wetlands that you can go visit, you can get out onto the water, there's a kayaking ramp, there's a fishing pier, it's a really beautiful space. But when we approached this project, we realized that the local community was not using the space. And it's because the local community didn't know that it existed and they didn't have access to it. So we wanted to get to know the community and try to address some of the barriers as to why they weren't using the site. And we applied for a lot of different grants to figure out how to get people out to the site and how to build community engagement programs within their communities to help them clean the communities up and create green and safe spaces in their actual communities as well. And some of those grants included engaging Latinx communities. So typically for an event at Masonville Cove, we would put it on a newsletter and we would send out flyers. And they were only in English, and we would get people from, the aquarium volunteers, we would get people to show up, but nobody from the local community and definitely nobody from the Latinx community. So we really noticed that we needed to do a targeted effort for that community, and we couldn't just translate the flyers into Spanish. That was not enough. We needed to really build meaningful relationships with the community. So the first thing that I did as the community coordinator when I got there was I drove around the community, and I was looking around for the assets of the community and where people were gathering. So where are the restaurants? Where are the grocery stores or the markets? Where are people congregating? And through that, we were able to identify the Taller congregation, which was a Latinx congregation, as one of the community pillars. They had a holding in the community, and it was a safe place where people gathered. So we decided to then look at who were the leaders in that congregation and establish relationships with those community leaders, because they're not just the pastor, they are leading the entire community. So Pastor Martinez and his wife, Veronica Martinez, I went and got coffee with them. And there were a few approaches I could have taken. I could have said, hey, I have this grant and I need to get some Hispanics out to our park, so could you come? And that wasn't going to work. I really wanted to build an authentic relationship as if I were making a friend, because ultimately what we built was a real friendship and a real relationship. I explained to them why Masonville Cove was such a unique and important site for the community, because it is a green space and a safe space where children can connect to nature in an authentic way, and gets you out of the craziness of the city into a really spiritual place. And a lot of congregations, they connect to spirituality, they connect to stewardship as a value, and we really used that in explaining our goals. And they came back and said that the places that they grew up near rivers, they grew up in the mountains, and they came to the United States and missed that access to the natural world and want that for their children. And so through those conversations, those deep conversations, we were able to establish meaningful and shared goals and connections for our programs. And we knew that we weren't just going to be planning an event and asking them to come out. We were going to be planning things together. But we did try it. We had already planned an event at Masonville Cove, and they invited us to the church where we flyered. So I translated the flyers into Spanish, invited the congregants to the event. Come the day of the event, and 3 people showed up, the pastor and his 2 sons. He was really disappointed that the congregation didn't show up, but he understood. You're asking people to come out to a place that they don't know, with people they don't know, to do something that they're not familiar with. So how could you expect them to trust you and come out to your event? So we could have canceled the event right there, and we said, you know what, we're gonna run the event with just these 3 participants, and his kids had a blast. The pastor recognized the value in environmental education and really bought in and was committed to getting his congregation to partner with us on events moving forward. But we knew that we couldn't just plan a watershed education event at Masonville Cove. We needed to plan it alongside the pastor and his wife and the church leaders. So we established a time and a place for Latino Conservation Week that summer, which is happening, it happens every summer in July. This year it was July 13th through the 21st. And it's a national week that's celebrated, run by the Hispanic Access Foundation. And places around the country participate in running events for this week. So the pastor and his wife and the church leaders, they helped to name the program. They helped to create the flyers. We asked them, what kinds of activities do you want to see? And they said, we like fishing, we like food, we like to have picnics. How can we build an event that's going to be fun and that's going to draw out the visitors? And we really included them in every step of the process. Now, to get the actual congregation out, we had to address some of the barriers. One is the trust. They didn't know what they were getting themselves into. So we went to the Sunday school at church and did some light programming with the Sunday school. We taught them about pollinators. We planted some pollinator plants there and planters that they could take home with them and take care of so that they could understand what kind of program they were getting into. And the kids loved it. They got their hands dirty while they were in church, and they were really excited to get to go outside and play, and their families were then excited. And another barrier was transportation. So we made sure that we had carpooling systems in place and vans in place, and that we did it right after their church service because they were already all together. And that was a way that we could successfully really get them out to the program. So the first year of establishing this Latino Conservation Week program was a huge success. We had the majority of the congregation out at Masonville Cove. It was a fun celebration. We had people there that were translating things into Spanish, but you don't also always have to translate. Most of the kids speak English, and that was really helpful. So we got their youth group to help to translate some of the programs so that we didn't have to hire translators. And you don't have to speak Spanish in order to do these kinds of programs. It helped that I speak Spanish, but other people on my staff did not, and they were perfectly capable of communicating with the visitors there. Some of the staff recognized the need to take that extra step, and they started learning some words in Spanish. Some of them started to take Spanish classes in the evenings because they really wanted to show the commitment to that community, that they are here to stay, they're here to build those trusting relationships and have this collaborative partnership. And after that one successful event, we didn't stop there. We continued to include them in all of the work that we were doing and build events that they really wanted to attend. So this included building pollinator gardens at the church, painting murals of monarch butterflies, which connect back to their home countries where they come from. It included doing community cleanups because trash was one of the really big issues in South Baltimore. And it was a successful partnership that even after I left the National Aquarium and went to Denver and Kansas City, those partnerships are still happening. I'm still getting invited back to community visioning sessions where I'm the only one speaking Spanish, but everybody else is there. They're still doing this work. And even in my new position at Chesapeake Conservancy, we're finding ways to include them meaningfully in the projects that we're doing. And we find ways that we can partner with other organizations who are doing this kind of work. So bringing this panel together was huge because not only are we here today to speak with you all about this topic, but Michelle and I were able to collaborate on bringing on 2 interns at Sandy Point State Park, which has been hugely successful this summer. And it's just been, it's a great collaboration, and it really does take a village. So some of the things that we learned through that, it's really important to embed yourself in the community. It's important to have these trusting relationships and community partners that build the bridges to the Latinx community. So if you don't want to go in blind, not knowing anything, partner with a different organization who has connections and who can introduce you to the people that you might want to know. And then empowering the communities into leadership. Oftentimes Latinx communities are seen as a receiver of services instead of a leader. And so by bringing them in and having them lead in these programs, they're taking ownership of it and making it their own. And then furthermore, stepping out of your comfort zone. This is a huge one because this work is very sensitive and it is very uncomfortable. But when you're uncomfortable, you know that you're doing good work. And even though I speak fluent Spanish, I felt super uncomfortable because I'm Mexican Spanish, not Guatemalan or Salvadorian. So we speak a little bit differently. And I'm Jewish. So I was going to church every Sunday to work with this community, and I'm Jewish, and that was something that was uncomfortable or new for me. And having conversations with people about that was really, eye-opening for a lot of people. So stepping out of that comfort zone is really important to do this work and to show that you care. And that's really what is important here, is showing that you care. So here are some tips that I just want to run through in trying to plan an outreach or an engaging event, from the planning all the way to the day of and after the event. So some of this is just reiterating what we've already talked about, but getting to know your community and the specific community that you want to reach, and including those community champions and leaders in the planning process. Meeting the community where they are. So whether that is at their local coffee shop, their local grocery store, their local church, wherever they feel the most comfortable, and that's going to show that you're there to really be on their side and on their team. And plan a fun event. Nobody wants to go to a boring event. Make sure that it's fun and that there's music, there's dancing, there's celebration, there's food. That's a big part of the culture of bringing people together for Latinx communities. So make sure that you're cognizant of that. You want to adapt your programs to make sure that they're culturally relevant and that you are recognizing and addressing those barriers. And there's a lot of barriers and they'll keep coming up. And I just think that they're great opportunities. They're not necessarily roadblocks. And then you want to adapt the way that you're promoting the events and reaching beyond your networks. So the first thing that we did was just sending out a newsletter about our event, and that didn't work. You really need to reach beyond your traditional networks to reach the audiences that you're trying to reach. When you're advertising, you want to personally invite people. That shows it's a personal invitation, right? So if it's a mass email, it's going to get ignored. But if you send someone a text message or call them up and say, hey, I really want you to come to this event. I think it's going to be really fun and you'll have a really good time. That is a lot more personal and it brings people out. You also want to provide information for your events and for your organizations with different Latinx organizations. And again, these are kind of non-traditional than what your organization might be used to reaching out to. So that's churches, health clinics, community resource centers, small businesses. I was going to, the lawyer or the cell phone companies, you know, those tiny little stores on the sides of the street, going to them and flyering there because that's where people are going. Talking to the waitresses at the Salvadorian restaurant near the church, you know, getting them and their families to come to the events. And then providing information through TV, radio, and Spanish language channels. So then when translating, again, you don't need to speak Spanish to engage with the Latinx community. But if possible, translate your information into Spanish, your flyers and the events, just to make sure that people are more comfortable. And offer some bilingual activities. And when you are planning the event, make sure that you're planning an event for the entire family. Make sure that you show that the programs show future opportunities for the youth, because parents care a lot about their youth. They want to see them succeed, and like Michelle said earlier, the median age is pretty young, and they want to see their future in the work that you're doing. And then, if possible, employ Latinx staff and interns to lead the programs, because having someone there that speaks like them or looks like them makes them feel a lot more included. It's not necessary, but it's definitely a great addition to the program. And this is a quote that Taller congregation wrote to us throughout the programming that we were doing that really proves and shows that this kind of meaningful connection goes beyond just, you know, checking off, you know, checkbox on your grant that I engage ex-Hispanic audiences, but they really got a lot out of it too. They said, it has been a great privilege to have helped our community because we have seen many happy faces of the people being thankful for keeping a clean and healthy environment. We are truly thankful to be a part of these events and hope to keep helping in any other community needs.
Now the way forward, what can you do from here on out? We have a few suggestions here, starting with the community, or with the outreach and engagement toolkit. It's a good idea to familiarize yourself with what each of those 4 parts mean and entail. There's a link on the reflection sheet that you'll find the toolkit there. So each part has a slide dedicated to itself, and there's a number of resources listed there that you can go to learn more and to also see how you can best apply it to your own situation. We also want to remind you to keep in mind those policies, practices, and your organizational structure. Do they make inclusivity and diversity possible, or are they themselves the barriers that are keeping you from being able to effectively do that? Again, even if it's not your intention, there are still ways that the exclusivity can pop up in your organizations. So be mindful and thoughtful of that as you move forward, and review them often, just to be aware of different forms of keeping people out. And also, as we saw in our presentation today, start a network. Meet with people and organizations that are doing this kind of work, that are in similar situations, that are at a point that you hope to reach in the future. Learn from each other, share resources, learn from each other's experiences, and that way everyone can move forward. And it's not, you know, just one organization doing, you know, leading the work. It's everyone across the state, across the country that's working appropriately and respectfully with Latinx communities. And then lastly, we'd encourage you to rethink traditional histories, traditional experts, and traditional research methodologies. These personal connections are a good way and an important way of including people, but also the history that you present at your site or in your organization can also send a message to other communities. If they don't see themselves represented in the history that you're sharing, it's going to be harder for them to connect to you, to trust you, and to really feel like they can take ownership of your work. Or of the work you hope to do together. And rethinking traditional experts, sometimes you just need to go to the community and learn from them, learn about their history. There's a lot of perspectives and histories that aren't usually seen in common secondary sources or even in primary sources that you would think to immediately consult when you're doing research. So look for different community organizations, cultural community organizations. In some cases, they may have already documented their history in their own way. Some communities rely more on oral histories that often are not taken as seriously as written documents. So be sure that you keep that in mind as you move forward. And then that goes in with research methodologies. Sometimes you just have to approach something completely different than what we've, my background's in history. You know, it's good to go in different ways that you've been trained to do so, because that just opens you up to different connections. And the way you interpret the past can help you make these connections now and get more people involved and committed to what we think is important. And so we hope that you keep in touch with us. We have contact information here for any questions, guidance, or resources. And now we'll...
Thank you to our presenters.